Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Advantage podcast, where HR, benefits, and total rewards leaders explore the future of workplace well-being. I'm your host, Stephen Sokoler, founder and CEO of Journey, the leading proactive mental health solution for modern companies. In each episode, we bring you expert insights, real-world strategies, and candid conversations on creating healthier, more productive workplaces. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Now let's dive in. Today, I'm joined by Laura Butler, Chief People Officer at TTEC. Laura and her team developed a job complexity and stress index, which I actually absolutely love, to evaluate which elements of work contribute to stress, burnout, and attrition. And at Journey, we believe that mental health is an outcome of how work is designed. And so what I love about this index is it makes things really measurable. So a question for you, Laura, when did you realize burnout isn't just about resilience, but about job design?
Well, one of the metrics that we track as an organization is turnover and why do people leave? And the nature of that information started having us go down a path of, most of the time, it's the job architecture. It's the work content that's being done. It's the intensity of it, the clarity of it, the care and concern of leaders. It is the system, actually, that has people leaving most of the time. And people say people leave managers, but I actually think it's more complex than that, shape and the design of work. And so that kind of started us down the path of how do we actually look at work and the structure of work.
And I realized that we just hopped in, but I probably should have taken a minute to ask, first off, how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. It's a beautiful day in Denver, Colorado.
Beautiful day to be alive. And perhaps maybe everybody's not so familiar. Can you tell us a little bit about TTEC?
TTEC is a 50,000 employee organization all over the globe. And we have people that are helping companies' most important assets, their customers, deliver smiles and happiness and through digital experiences as well as human experiences. Our vision is to bring humanity to work and into business.
Fantastic. And let's hop back in and talk about high complexity. So what makes a job high complexity?
High complexity job. So let's talk about the experience of the digital experience. So people having multiple systems to consult from a system perspective, having to find information through a variety of different sources, having to click into lots of different technologies and user experiences. And so that's one dimension of complexity. Another dimension of complexity is how many stakeholders and people need to be interacted with and consulted with throughout that element. That's complicated. The actual work content, the job to be done, and how complex that is, what type of technical knowledge, what type of education and experiential background is another dimension of complexity. And then the KPIs and the measurement, how stretched are those targets and goals based on the experience and skill set that is here today. And it's one of the things I think that we really are experiencing with AI, that everyone's job just got more complex because that gap between what you know and what's required is shifting. I mean, even when you look at AI classes, they're changing so often that oftentimes by the time you're taking the class, the curriculum has changed. So that gap is creating more complexity in order to simplify, in service of simplification, in service of making it easier. But that, again, is another dimension of complexity. So you've got the systems, environment, and the stakeholder component, and then you have the gap between what you're being asked to do and your skills and experiences to do that and to achieve your outcomes.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the job complexity and stress index. When did you create it? What prompted the creation of that? I found it to be a really fascinating story.
So the stress index, as we started to think about what are the variations, kind of going back to attrition, why are people leaving? Why in one program are they leaving more than another? And breaking that down into different elements, including scheduling. What are the consistency of those hours, the training efficacy, how people are trained to take customer calls and to interact with customers, the customer sentiment. So even as you look at reputational factors, et cetera, how does that impact the interactions that associates have? The interactional channel, is it real time on the fly, or is it something more delayed, like chat type of channels? Technology and tools, fewer, it's stable, easier to use versus many. Competencies that are required, what requires more autonomous decision making, what requires less, the key performance indicators, compliance and risk. When we started looking at these factors of a job and evaluating every job against each factor, it became very clear what was driving stress. And changes, and I say simple, it's never quite that simple, but changing that to say, let's streamline the technology, let's manage the schedule, let's look at the hiring profile that better to the work. There are many things that we can do architecturally and system-wide to really lower the stress burden in a job. It's way beyond, make sure everyone knows that you have an employee assistance program and are getting help, but actually, how is the work designed? And by applying a consistent rubric, program over program, it would help us explain that. And where we couldn't make a change, maybe just factually, this is actually quite a stressful job. What are other interventions that we can put in place to help lower that stress? And it just gave us a system-wide way to really approach work.
Yeah, I love that. What variables most strongly drive stress in the workplace?
I think that it starts with the way that you match talent to a job, to be honest, because let's face it, all of us, when we're asked to do something that we are not prepared to do, and we may not have the skill or background and the tools to support that, you hear the term being ahead of your skis or out of your depth. The bigger gap that is really at the very beginning, we're not set up for success in a job. And so having clarity around the skills and experiences that are needed for the job and then managing that gap, I think is the top thing that needs to be looked at.
Yeah. Were there any big surprises to you in the correlation between stress levels and attrition?
Yes. And so when you look at people, that gap, that competency gap, there are people that are really excited about that and they want to close the gap and they're motivated, and that they aren't stressed by that gap at all. And so when you look at some of the soft skills and people coming on board and measuring kind of that will in addition to looking at the skill, that was equally as important as trying to close that gap. I think another surprise was the variability in what would be the same job, but based on the technology, based on the scheduling, it had a very different impact on stress. And by learning from those programs that had a lower complexity level in terms of systems, just that impact allowed us to make investments in technology with clear ROI in lowering stress, which ultimately made the job more attractive and actually even made it easier to hire.
Yeah, well said. Let's talk about burnout. So it's a word that we've heard a lot about over the last, 5+ years. Why should burnout be viewed as an occupational phenomenon? How do you think about burnout? It's probably a better way of saying that.
I think the burnout, and this is a real topic right now, I think burnout happens for internal and external factors, but it's really, in my view, it's when the gas tank is empty. And how do you keep that gas tank replenished? And how do you ensure that you're filling your tank and understand that? So I think that when I think about burnout, I think that we need to make sure that sustainable work isn't about endurance, it's about design and how is the work designed. And so in one organization, we had a task that was repetitive and it was tightly measured and it was productivity related. And so it was designed that it was a little bit of a grind. Just repeat. And that created burnout. Which was an erosion of quality. It was dissatisfaction, increased stress. So what we did is we actually took that job and a job that involved more creativity, and you would have a certain amount of time on that repetitious job, and then you would switch to a job that required more creativity. And by going back between those two things, that very simple act created less burnout. It actually created better results because the attention switching back and forth, not multitasking, lots of studies that that's actually worse and doesn't work, but more focused on type of task and then switch to a different task. And just that organ design, that work architecture is what really helped this not be an endurance test, but more of work design, and generated some much stronger outcomes.
It's really interesting. I had switched the way I did things where I was prioritizing things in terms of what's most important. And in my work, it might be I have this strategy thing, and then a sales thing, and then a client thing, and then a product thing. And what I found was it was really mentally exhausting, even though I was working in the best order, versus grouping things that allowed my brain to function and work in one way and then have space to work in a different way, because they're all, very different types of thinking and also emotionally, right? If you're dealing with a existing client versus a new client versus a product thing versus strategy. And so I appreciate that. Any other thoughts on things that companies can do structurally or otherwise to help when it comes to burnout?
I think that being really intentional about the role that humans play in the cycle. So more and more technology is getting introduced into work and how it's getting introduced into work. And that human in the loop, that coaching, that checking in. We recently had an experience where we were doing some training and the trainer could tell that an employee was really struggling. And so after the training was done, they called the individual. And in fact, the individual was having a personal crisis. And the impact that was able to make, that I think that humanity is so important in recognizing burnout, because it is individual when people hit that individually. So you might have a system in place and you've got the rotation happening. You're designing the schedule to align with people's needs. You've designed it correctly. There's still that moment of noticing when it's not working. And I actually think that noticing when it's not working, that's the human touch. That's the part that when you're looking at KPIs and you're looking at data, it's very difficult to pull the report out that would say, John is having a hard day today. It's beyond the work design. And I think that still will always be a very important component that you just can't tell. AI can't tell that.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about redesigning work. You touched on it before. How is TTEC using the index to adjust roles and KPIs and tools, training, other things that the index has unlocked for you?
One of the things when people come to work is what's their startup process? How do you start your day? And so we've created kind of the startup bot to help really streamline how people start their day so that beginning doesn't have friction. It's simple and easy, intuitive. And so people can start their day without having IT issues and I can't log into this system. And you start your day with that level of frustration. It's difficult to overcome that, because even if the rest of the day is fine, you still carry that frustration. It's like having bad traffic on the way to work, and it's just hard. And so we want to ensure that we have that great startup experience and that focus on that first, what does the first half an hour look like? One thing is actually substantial, and that was a technical intervention on how we designed the work. What do they have to do? How do they have to do that? And how do we leverage technology to make that simple? Huge impact. It not only made people's jobs better and the KPIs and the satisfaction better, it actually makes employees like their job better too. So that ultimately impacts attrition in a positive way.
Thanks for listening to the first half of the episode. I hope you're walking away with some valuable insights. I want to take a quick pause to tell you about my book, The Mental Health Advantage. If you found this conversation useful, you'll find 300 more pages packed with strategies, insights, and real-world applications. Grab your copy on Amazon. Just check the show notes for the link. And if you're looking for a more comprehensive mental health solution for your company, let's chat. You'll find another link in the show notes to reach out and explore how Journey can help you. Now back to the show. How do you think about the difference between a healthy challenge and unsustainable complexity?
I think that it goes back to variety, that the healthy challenge is important. And then there is a time-bound element that, okay, now let's go back to something more familiar, and being able to throttle between those things. So too often, as an example, what you might see in general administrative team members, they get promoted to leadership and they keep going back to the tactical things that they did well as an individual contributor. And that's because that's their comfort. That's just natural human behavior. Just go back to what I know and what's comfortable. And so when you've got those stretch moments and those stretch elements, to have a coach or a mentor in the system, and there's actually more agenic coaches and mentors to help pull people back into that area of discomfort, to keep practicing and trying those elements. So what we've done is we have really invested in a proprietary coaching platform to help provide that coaching in the flow of work in a way that is not intimidating, but really helps people continue to try to stretch and to grow. When you ignore that, people do revert back to what they know. It's familiar and it's human behavior. And so providing a coaching, a healthy place to expand, to learn, to experiment as a part of the system of work is something that we're doing and seeing tremendous benefits. It's actually helpful even for the coach to have the specific ways to coach and the model to coach and really elevate performance. So coaching in the system of work has been a way that we've helped balance that.
That's great. So if I'm an HR leader and I'm listening and I'm hearing this all sounds amazing, where do I start? What's one thing that I can do to start assessing complexity or making changes to really have an impact on my organization?
It's a great question. And I think that's really where you look at the attributes of a job. So and we started with attrition. We started looking at, okay, where our attrition is very low, where is it high? And is it based on job title? Or are there job levels that attrition is different? Because attrition is a good lagging indicator of where you might have burnout, might have a system that isn't working. So once those identified, because it's all priority, high priority, jobs, levels, this is our focus area, then breaking that down and looking at the hours consistency, the training efficacy, the customer sentiment, the person profile, the technology and tools that are required, and then start to compare across that sector. Immediately, you'll start to see where there are opportunities to impact the system in a positive way. And to say, okay, even look at hours as an example. So sometimes if you look at the hours that people have to work, and this is where leveraging a global network can be helpful, is to say, if we do have to provide having coverage on something common in IT, common in customer care, then can we look at doing that in a location where it isn't overnight for them? Is there a location where that would make sense? Or where overnight work has higher population, because that can create stress. And so looking at that. The other thing right now, and a lot of the headlines have been around, I think, different companies making organizational changes and laying off individuals. Well, job security, that is actually a heavy stressor. When people have job insecurity, they do not know, am I going to have a job next week or not? I think one of the basic things that can be done, and this is across all levels and all roles, is helping people develop resilient careers. What are the skills that they're developing that will help them inside and outside the company? Transparent company communication so that things aren't a surprise as much as possible. Being honest about how business decisions are made around role design cause a company to change strategy. And this is an area that I actually think right now, job insecurity is a tremendous stressor. And these headlines, I know a lot of readers, a lot of eyeballs on those headlines, but we still have a deficit of open jobs in the country against people to fill those jobs. The mismatch is the skill set, and helping people understand how to build that skill set inside the company they're in now can help them feel more in control of what seems like they have no control over right now.
I agree completely. We're certainly going into interesting times. So we'll see what happens and how much of that falls on the employee or the employer in terms of reskilling and the government, things like that. But staying within the company realm, complexity, compensation, fairness, how does complexity data inform wage strategy?
The more complicated jobs should correlate with higher compensation. Absolutely, they should. When there is a mismatch of compensation, low compensation for a very complicated job, there is a low applicant pool. Then the people in those jobs, they might have gotten the job, but then they're in those jobs and they don't feel like it's fair. This job is really complicated and I could be doing something far more simple for the same amount of money. Then they will switch. If they can't, because they lack an alternative for a same compensation for an easier job based on the market that they're in, then that creates more and more stress and frustration. So aligning compensation and complexity, that in and of itself, even if it's complicated and highly complex, even when they have a skill gap, they will close that gap with more satisfaction because they understand why these two things, they're compensated and complexity, and they understand that and they will reach that bar. It is so critical. And also when people have the right compensation, that brings their stress level, external factors as well, ensuring that they can do that. So even on the benefit side, earned wage access, where people have access to their income on a daily basis, that earned wage access can give them a lot more feeling of control on compensation. So again, complexity and compensation are tightly tied together. And when that's mismatched, it does raise frustration and burnout, and it's not good. It has to be aligned.
It is not good. That is true. Well, let's talk a little bit more about higher stress. So when does higher stress signal a need for a redesign of the role versus higher support?
I think that redesign or higher support are two really interesting questions. Sometimes redesigning is not an option because the boundary conditions it is what it is, and redesign isn't an option. Then you go into we need a higher skill set, and redesigning the work is let's say the most available rather than having to go find new people or mismatch a profile. So looking at the work architecture, if that would be the first path. However, sometimes it just isn't. So what we often do, we partner with a company called Harvard. We'll do an assessment on a job to see how are we matching that profile with the work. And when there's a gap, the first thing is, well, can we redesign the work? And if the answer is no, actually we can't, it is actually hard work. It's actually hard. And so then we look at, okay, then how do we need to change the profile of who it is that we're bringing in to kind of close that gap? And when you look at stress and the stress index, it really is about the gap between the person and the work, and looking at hours work for some people, not for others. Even things like remote work versus being on-prem. A lot of companies are bringing people back to work right now 5 days a week. Well, doing that one act of bringing people back 5 days a week, it's interesting. That does increase a different type of stress on now I have to make arrangements. I have to make sure I've laundered my clothes, all sorts of things that you think, packing my lunch, all sorts of things to come back into an office. I have to endure traffic, parking, etc. All of that noise to come back 5 days a week. The offset of that from a work design perspective needs to be, am I getting a better sense of community by doing that? Am I getting better outcomes or better output, more creativity? Am I able to use that more? Do I have more limbic time rather than Zoom call to Zoom call to Zoom call, which can squeeze out any creativity? Now I have an ability to walk around, talk to people in the cafeteria. Is that offset worth the additional stress that that's going to bring into a work environment? Coming in and being in your cube all day just to make all the same phone calls you would have made at home, I would argue that is actually not helpful to the stress index.
No, it's probably not healthy either. I remember when friends were being called back to the office and they were like, it's maddening. I wake up, I have to shower, was no longer optional. I have to put on clothes, no longer optional. I have to get there, whether that's taking the subway or car or what have you. And then I get there and I spend the whole day on Zoom meetings. It's like, what are we doing here? Why am I here? So yeah, I can relate to that. Those are things that are often overlooked, right? Because the leaders have the best of intentions, right? Being in office, you can collaborate, you can do this, which is all true. But then the actual day-to-day, where the rubber hits the road with the work experience is much different.
There was, I think it was Marissa Myers maybe who was talking about this, but I thought it was really well put to say that, when you're working at home or remotely, it's about productivity. And when you're in an office, it's about creativity. And so being able to, back to that pivoting, being able to have some time in your structured work and your productivity-oriented work, pivoting with the creative work. And that can be through, we see hybrid schedules, but it can also be deliberately bringing people together for more creative together work, being intentional about creativity, where I think for so long we were sloppy about it in a way. We just knew it would happen. And then after COVID, the productivity, and we saw this actually in metrics, that when people first went home, the productivity did not take a hit at all. It was, and granted, there wasn't anything else to do but work, but at the time, it really did show that working from home can produce really high productivity results. But then, again, when there's not that alternation, the creativity starts to drop and the innovation starts to drop. So you do need time for both of those things. And that is important to mental health. It's important to getting the best out of a human being.
Yep. Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about data. So what excites you most about using data to move mental health upstream?
I love being able to take agentic AI now and pull a data set in, like something as simple as employee engagement scores, pulling in a database and just being able to ask questions about where people's mental health is, putting in models. So, the mental health advantage as an example, there's some really great points, and being able to use those points to inquire against a data set to say what's showing up as options here that we could do and let low-hanging fruit. I like how data now isn't about completely running the rows, counting the rows, sorting. It's about understanding the insights that data has to offer to say, where are we seeing technology as a barrier? So I was recently looking at some metrics around people who leave without clocking out and why. And being able to ask different questions of the data brought up an insight that people start to leave the building, but like before they've left their job, they start to think about, I need to get home, and do I stop at the store, or all the things. So that is an interesting intervention. And how do we help make sure that they still are clocking out? But then there was also a percentage that didn't clock out because of technical challenges. And so those are easy to solve. So let's solve those. And then going in little things like putting candy by a time clock machine so that people go to stop there as a ritual on their way out to grab the candy, can remind people to clock out. But then we start to address what's the system that prevents that. But it all came from data to say how many people aren't clocking out before they leave every day. So it's the insight and then the action. That's the most exciting to me, is that's closing that loop instead of taking a couple weeks to get the report, then looking at the insight, then deciding what to do, you can come to all of those conclusions within a half an hour, and it used to take weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. It's such a great use of data. What's one misconception leaders still have about burnout?
That it's a person problem and it's not a system problem. That it's this individual it's because of them and their attributes, and not taking a step back to say, what's the job architecture? What's even the organizational architecture? Should this job be done by just one person or breaking it up in multiple people? And so I think that people look at the mistake and the misconception is looking at it that this is an individual's issue and it isn't the company's issue. That is a misconception that, again, I think is very risky. It's risky even to business continuity and stability as well.
Yep. Yep. All right. Last question I have for you. If you could redesign one element of work tomorrow to reduce stress, what would it be?
Such a good question. I would say one element. Gosh, there's a few elements. I would say right now,
we have time. You can give us a few if you want.
I would say to reduce stress in one element is to look at the technology, the technical experience, that startup on how do you spend your day technically, how many systems, even things that we're looking at with people. Is it email? Is it chat? Is it Teams? Is it this? Is it that? But really looking at the system, the digital work experience. And why look at that first is because that is one of the easiest things to change at scale versus individual jobs, is just looking at that digital work experience. As I mentioned, the startup bot, what does the beginning of a day look like? How are people getting introduced to work in the day? I think that one area of the employee experience would make a big difference.
I love that. Well, Laura, thank you. As always, you have impressed me with your wisdom, your depth. I appreciate all of the work that you're doing to support your 50,000+ employees, and thank you for sharing it here. Any final words of wisdom or inspiration as we set sail on the weekend here?
I would just say that high-performing cultures are built on trust, clarity, and care, and that leaders need to architect work that allows people to thrive, not just produce, but to really thrive. And that's where exciting things happen.
I love that. Perfect place to wrap. Laura, thank you so much. For everybody listening, feel free to follow and share, and have a beautiful day. Thanks for spending this time with us. We know you're busy. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe to the Mental Health Advantage and leave a review. Thanks so much, and have a beautiful day.